In the spring of 1200 BC, a young girl named Namera stood trembling in the wide courtyard of the temple of Ammoniusare at Thebes. The morning sun poured over the stone pillars, casting long shadows across the floor. Around her, a circle of priests moved slowly and silently. One of them carried a bronze razor that glinted in the light. Namera was only 9 years old. Her father, a humble clerk in the royal storehouses, stood nearby, his face pale and tight. 3 days earlier, he had brought her here. He owed the temple more grain and silver than he could ever repay. The priests had given him an option, to surrender his daughter as payment. Before we delve into these overlooked tales of endurance and pain, if you find yourself drawn to the hidden corners of history, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories like this. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. I am always amazed that we can explore these ancient narratives together, no matter where we are in the world, united by our curiosity about the past. He told her it was an honor, that she would serve the gods and live among holy people. But as the priest shaved her head clean, cutting away every strand of her black hair, Namera began to cry. The cold metal scraped against her scalp again and again until it burned. One of the senior priestesses stepped forward and struck her sharply across the face. "Servants of the god do not cry," she said. "You have no tears now. You have no name. You belong to Ammoniusare." The words echoed through the courtyard, sinking deep into the child's mind. In that moment, her life as she knew it ended. The temple walls closed around her like a cage she would never leave. For the next 40 years, this would be her world. A life ruled by rituals and silence, built on obedience and fear, hidden behind walls painted with scenes of gods and perfection. She would never again see her home, never marry, never choose her own path. What Namera didn't know then was that she was not alone. There were thousands of girls like her, given to temples across Egypt, living and dying as servants of the divine. They were called wives of the god, hands of the goddess, or pure ones. Their titles sounded sacred, but behind those words was a life stripped of freedom. People today imagine the temple women as elegant figures, graceful, spiritual, and honored. But that image is a lie, born from the carvings and the propaganda of the priests who wrote Egypt's history. The truth was darker. Most of these girls had been taken before they were old enough to understand what was happening. Some were given as offerings by families seeking the gods' favor. Others, like Namera, were handed over to repay debts. The temples were not just religious centers. They were powerful institutions that owned land, lent money, collected taxes, and enslaved those who couldn't pay. To the priests, these girls were currency, living possessions masked in the language of holiness. There were others too, children captured in wars and brought from faraway lands. Egyptian soldiers often raided Nubia and Libya, taking not only gold and cattle but young girls. They were delivered to the temples as tributes, absorbed into the same system of ritual servitude. One of those girls was Lunara, a child from Nubia. She was 8 when soldiers entered her village, gathering tribute for Pharaoh, ivory, gold, and children. Tied together with ropes, Lunara and 12 others walked for weeks across the desert, frightened and hungry. She didn't speak the Egyptian tongue. When she cried, a soldier hit her and told her to be silent. From then on, she learned to weep quietly. When they reached Thebes, Lunara was given to the temple of the goddess Moode, the goddess of motherhood. The cruel irony of it would only reveal itself with time. The goddess of mothers was served by girls who were never allowed to become mothers themselves. Inside the temple, the process that turned a child into a servant of the gods began immediately. It was not training. It was breaking, designed to erase every part of who they had been. The first ritual was called the purification by water. Namera was led to a stone pool filled with cold water mixed with natron, a type of salt used in rituals. 3 priests and 2 older women stood waiting. She hesitated to undress, but one of the women grabbed her and tore her clothes away. The priest told her to step into the pool. The water was so cold that her body shook. Then, under the pretense of cleansing, the priests examined every part of her body, pretending it was sacred. When Namera tried to pull away, one of them gripped her arm tightly and said, The gods are watching. They test your obedience. She froze, trembling, too afraid to resist. That was the moment she learned that her body was no longer hers. It belonged to the temple. Afterward came the shaving ritual. Every trace of hair was removed. From her head, her eyebrows, even her body. Officially, this was for ritual purity, but it was truly about control. Hair was tied to identity and pride. Removing it erased individuality. When Namera looked into the polished bronze mirror afterward, she didn't recognize herself. The face staring back was empty, hollow. Next came the renaming. Her birth name, the one her mother whispered when she held her as a baby, was taken away forever. The priests gave her a new name, Namera, meaning the chosen of Ammonius. She was told never to speak her true name again. It belonged to her old life, which was now considered dead. That renaming marked her symbolic death. She was no longer her father's daughter. She was now the property of the temple. But the final ritual was the darkest of all, the divine marriage ceremony. Each girl was said to be married to the god she would serve. It sounded holy, even beautiful, but it was the foundation of their lifelong bondage. At 10 years old, Lunara went through the same ritual at the Temple of Moode. Dressed in white linen, her small body covered in gold ornaments, she was led into the temple's inner sanctuary, a place only the priests were normally allowed to enter. In front of her stood a towering statue of the goddess. The high priest began to chant, saying he spoke with the goddess's voice. He declared that Lunara was chosen, pure, and blessed to become the goddess's eternal bride. She repeated the vows as she was told, saying words she couldn't understand. I give myself to Moode. My body is her temple. My life is her offering. I will serve forever. Those words sealed her fate. It was not a holy marriage, it was a legal contract of ownership. A girl married to a god could never marry a man, never bear children of her own, never leave. From that day on, Lunara, like Namera, belonged entirely to the temple. Inside the temple of Ammonius, life ran like a clock that never stopped. Every sound, every step, every breath had its place in time. For Namera, days soon blurred together into one endless cycle of silence and obedience. She lived in a shared dormitory with dozens of other girls. They slept on thin reed mats lined neatly in rows. Older attendants, women who had been in the temple for decades, watched over them like guards. Privacy didn't exist. Even at night, someone's eyes were always open. Before dawn, the temple bells rang. The girls rose quietly, washed themselves in cold water, and dressed in plain white linen robes. Those robes were the color of ritual purity and of captivity. They were forbidden from wearing jewelry or color unless ordered by the priests. The mornings began with prayers and purification rites. They stood in rows, repeating chants they barely understood while the priests walked among them, inspecting every movement. Afterward came their daily labor. Namera's first assignment was in the weaving halls. From sunrise until late afternoon, she sat at a wooden loom, her fingers stiff and sore as she wove cloth for temple offerings and garments for priests. The work was slow and repetitive, meant to crush the mind as much as the body. Talking was forbidden. If a girl whispered or laughed, she was struck. The silence was heavy, a silence that stripped away the feeling of being human. Her only comfort was a girl named Sira, a few years older. They worked side by side, sometimes exchanging short glances or quiet smiles when no one was watching. Once, Namera dared to whisper, "Do you remember your home?" Before Sira could answer, the supervisor appeared. The sound of a wooden stick hitting flesh echoed through the hall. Sira was dragged outside, her face pale but silent. For 3 days she was gone. When she returned, she no longer spoke at all. Her eyes were dull, her movements mechanical. 2 months later, she disappeared completely. The overseer told the others she had been returned to the gods. No one asked what that meant. Everyone already knew. Surveillance inside the temple was constant. Guards stood at the gates, and scribes recorded every hour of every woman's life. Letters from families were forbidden. Visitors were not allowed. The girls might as well have been ghosts. Even their thoughts were policed. The priests taught them that disobedience was a sin against the gods. They repeated those lessons daily. Your body is a vessel. Your soul belongs to Ammonius. Your desires are dust. After years of hearing it, the girls began to believe it. Every few days, the priests performed purity inspections. They claimed these were sacred rituals, but in truth, they were violations, invasions disguised as holy acts. The women were examined and touched without choice, told that their obedience was a test of faith. Namera's first assignment was in the weaving halls. From sunrise until late afternoon, she sat at a wooden loom, her fingers stiff and sore as she wove cloth for temple offerings and garments for priests. The work was slow and repetitive, meant to crush the mind as much as the body. Talking was forbidden. If a girl whispered or laughed, she was struck. The silence was heavy, a silence that stripped away the feeling of being human. Her only comfort was a girl named Sira, a few years older. They worked side by side, sometimes exchanging short glances or quiet smiles when no one was watching. Once, Namera dared to whisper, "Do you remember your home?" Before Sira could answer, the supervisor appeared. The sound of a wooden stick hitting flesh echoed through the hall. Sira was dragged outside, her face pale but silent. For 3 days she was gone. When she returned, she no longer spoke at all. Her eyes were dull, her movements mechanical. 2 months later, she disappeared completely. The overseer told the others she had been returned to the gods. No one asked what that meant. Everyone already knew. Surveillance inside the temple was constant. Guards stood at the gates, and scribes recorded every hour of every woman's life. Letters from families were forbidden. Visitors were not allowed. The girls might as well have been ghosts. Even their thoughts were policed. The priests taught them that disobedience was a sin against the gods. They repeated those lessons daily. Your body is a vessel. Your soul belongs to Ammonius. Your desires are dust. After years of hearing it, the girls began to believe it. Every few days, the priests performed purity inspections. They claimed these were sacred rituals, but in truth, they were violations, invasions disguised as holy acts. The women were examined and touched without choice, told that their obedience was a test of faith. In time, some of the girls began to disappear. The older ones whispered that they had been selected for sacred duties. At first, Namera didn't know what that meant. Then one night she found out. The temple held ceremonies called the Unions of the Gods. On the walls, the scenes looked beautiful. Painted images of gods joining with goddesses, symbols of creation and fertility. The priests told the girls that these rituals kept Egypt's land fertile and the Nile flowing. But behind those closed doors, the truth was far from divine. The high priests dressed in sacred robes and masks, claiming that during the ritual, the spirit of the god entered their bodies. The chosen girls, called wives of the god, were told they would receive the god's blessing. They were warned that refusal was blasphemy, that resistance would bring destruction to Egypt itself. And so, one by one, they obeyed. When Namera was 14, she was chosen for her first union. The attendants dressed her in fine linen and gold, told her she was about to become the bride of Ammonius Ra. She was led through torchlit corridors into the inner sanctuary, where incense filled the air so thickly she could hardly breathe. The high priest, his face hidden behind a golden mask, told her to bow. Then he stepped closer and whispered, "You are chosen. The god accepts you." When his hands reached toward her, she didn't understand at first. When she did, she froze. He told her that to resist was to insult Ammonius himself. The other priests stood watching, murmuring prayers. That night was recorded in the temple scrolls as a successful divine union. But Namera knew the truth. It was not sacred. It was violation, a holy lie written in gold. By the time Namera turned 16, she had served the temple for more than half her life. The years had carved away the softness of childhood, leaving behind quiet endurance. She no longer cried. She no longer hoped. But somewhere deep inside, a small part of her still remembered what freedom once felt like, a half-forgotten warmth she could not erase. When she began to feel ill and dizzy, she thought it was exhaustion. The weaving hall was stifling that summer, and food had been scarce. But when the priest-physician examined her, he nodded to the overseer with a knowing look. The next day, Namera was moved to a separate lodging within the temple, a quiet place on the eastern side where only certain women lived. It didn't take long for her to understand. She was pregnant. The priests called it a divine gift, claiming it proved that the god Ammonius-Ra had blessed her. But Namera knew better. The child she carried was not the god's. It was the result of that night in the inner sanctuary, a secret the temple would never admit. Around her were other women, all in the same condition, each one chosen for holy unions that had left them expecting children. Some were as young as 13. An older woman named Tasha took care of them. She was kind but weary, her eyes heavy with years of sorrow. One night, as she helped Namera lie down, she whispered, "Don't hope too much. When your child is born, they will take it away. If it's a girl, she'll serve here like you. If it's a boy, the priests will raise him to serve the temple. Either way, you will never see them again." Her voice trembled, but her face stayed composed. She had said those words too many times before. When Namera gave birth, it was to a daughter small, dark-haired, and beautiful. She named her Leia in secret, though the priests never allowed her to speak the name aloud. For 3 years, Namera raised her within the women's quarters. She sang to her softly at night, songs that came from fragments of memory, melodies her own mother once hummed. Those years were the only happiness she ever knew. But as the priests had promised, the time came when they took the child away. Namera was told that her daughter had been chosen to begin training as a servant of the god. She watched silently as 2 attendants led the little girl down the corridor. Leia turned back once, confused, reaching for her mother. But the door closed between them, and Namera never saw her again. She returned to her work as though nothing had happened. The temple left no room for mourning. Grief was considered impurity. Sometimes she caught sight of her daughter in the distance, a small bald-headed child walking in a line of others, repeating chants she herself had once learned. She wanted to call out, to run to her, to hold her one more time, but even a glance could bring punishment. That silent agony became her constant companion. Life in the temple continued in the same rhythm, but something had changed inside Namera. She began to look at the priests differently. Their words no longer sounded divine. The ceremonies no longer seemed sacred. She saw only control disguised as holiness. And she was not the only one. Among the women, whispers began to spread. Quiet, fragile things that could have cost them their lives. Tiny gestures of rebellion started to appear. A woman might weave a small mistake into the cloth she made. A hidden pattern spelling faint words like, "I remember" or "I resist." Some left small carvings on the walls of their quarters, symbols of freedom that the priests didn't recognize. One woman named Renura was not as cautious. She had served the temple for more than 20 years, and something in her had broken beyond repair. One midday meal, she suddenly stood up and shouted, "This is not holy. These men are not gods. We are prisoners." The hall went silent. The guards seized her immediately. Every woman in the temple was forced to watch as Renura was taken beyond the walls, into the desert. The high priest announced that she was being returned to the sun in purification. They left her there under the scorching heat without food or water. The next morning, the women were brought to see what remained of her body. The high priest raised his hands and said, "This is the fate of the impure." But Renura's defiance left something behind, a spark that the priests couldn't extinguish. After that day, no one shouted. Rebellion became invisible. It survived in glances, in hidden words, in silent acts of courage. Even Lunara, now grown and quiet, began to feel it. She had long since stopped singing, but she hadn't forgotten. The old Nubian in her still whispered in her dreams. She started to scratch small marks into the walls of her sleeping quarters. Not words at first, just symbols from her village. When one of the other women noticed, Lunara said softly, "If they erase our names, we'll write ourselves in stone." That night, Namera found one of those carvings. a small circle with a single line through it. It meant home. She touched it gently with her fingers, feeling something stir inside her that she thought had died. For the first time in many years, she allowed herself to believe in something. Not the gods, not freedom, but the power of memory. The priests could control their bodies, but not their thoughts. They could erase their names, but not their will to remember who they were. And so, quietly, resistance began to live within the cracks of the temple, in hidden carvings, in unspoken songs, in eyes that met for just a moment too long. Still, the years rolled on, and most of them grew old inside those walls. Few ever saw the sky beyond the temple gates again. When one of the older women died, there was no mourning. Her body was wrapped in linen, placed in a pit with others, and covered without a name or a prayer. The priests said it was holy burial, but to the women it was just another act of forgetting. Namera often wondered how many of them had lived and died this way, unseen, unnamed, their stories buried beneath the stone floors of the temple's people still admired as monuments of beauty. She had long since stopped praying to the gods. Instead, she prayed that someone, someday, would remember them. The older Namera grew, the more invisible she became. The priests no longer looked at her. To them, she had served her purpose. She had given the temple her youth, her labor, and her child. Now she was just another quiet shadow moving through the halls. But in that invisibility, she found a strange kind of power. The overseers paid little attention to the older women, so she began to move more freely, helping the younger ones, whispering advice about how to survive the priest's cruelty. She told them when to stay silent, when to look away, when to hide their tears. She didn't speak of rebellion. That word was too dangerous. But in her voice, the younger women heard something the priests had never taught them: tenderness. Years passed. Her hands grew rough, her hair turned silver, and the temple kept running like the machine it had always been. The world outside changed. Kings died, wars began and ended, but within the stone walls, time stood still. Sometimes at night, when the moonlight slipped through the narrow slits in the wall, Namera thought she saw her daughter, grown now, passing by in priestess robes. Once, their eyes met across the courtyard. The girl paused, her gaze uncertain, as if something in Namera's face felt familiar. But then she turned and walked away, her steps measured, her expression calm. Another servant of the god. That moment haunted Namera. She realized her daughter had become part of the same system that had taken her away. Still, she didn't blame her. How could she? The child had never known any other life. One evening, when the air was thick with the scent of burning incense, Lunara came to her quarters. Her face was thin, her eyes tired but sharp. "They say you've stopped chanting during the morning rites," she whispered. "I no longer remember the words," Namera said quietly. Lunara looked around to make sure no one was listening, then leaned closer. "Some of us still remember more than words." From under her robe, she pulled a small clay shard, a broken piece of a water jar. On it, carved in uneven lines, was a message in their old tongue. Namera couldn't read it, but she felt the meaning in her chest. "It means we lived," Lunara said, "before they took our names, before they called us holy." They began to gather the women who still dared to think, who still carried pieces of memory from their childhoods. In the silence of the night, they met in the storage chambers below the weaving hall, a place rarely visited by priests. There, they whispered their old names, the ones they had been forced to forget. Namera spoke hers for the first time in decades. The sound of it made her cry. Each woman shared her story, where she came from, who she was before the temple, who she had loved, and who she had lost. They wept, they laughed softly, and they promised that if the temple took their lives, it would not take their stories. They began to carve their names and memories into the walls, not openly, but behind the heavy curtains, under the clay jars, in corners where light rarely reached. The carvings were small and rough, but they were theirs. It was their way of saying, "We were here." Weeks turned into months. One night, a young attendant discovered one of the carvings. The priests ordered an investigation. The women knew punishment would come, but none confessed. When the overseer demanded to know who was responsible, every one of them stepped forward. "All of us," they said in one voice. The priests were furious. They declared that the women had defiled sacred walls. As punishment, the entire group was locked in the lower chambers with no food or water. The temple would erase them, as it had so many others. But the priests didn't realize that their punishment had already failed. In the dark, surrounded by silence, Namera felt no fear. She sat against the wall, tracing the carvings with her fingers. Around her, the women began to hum softly. Not the chants of the temple, but the old songs from their villages, from the river, from the world that existed before the chains. Their voices rose together, faint at first, then stronger. It was not rebellion in the way men understood it. It was not a cry of war or defiance. It was memory, living, breathing memory. That night, the temple walls heard something they had never heard before. The sound of women reclaiming their names. By morning, their voices had faded. The guards found only stillness. The priests wrote in the temple records that the women had surrendered their bodies to Ammonia's eternal peace. They sealed the chamber and never spoke of it again. Centuries later, when the temple ruins were uncovered by explorers, they found faint carvings along one of the buried walls, a series of lines and symbols no one could fully translate. Among them were words in different tongues, names scratched by unsteady hands. Some were almost invisible, but one stood out clearly enough to read. "We lived." The archaeologists thought it was a prayer. They were wrong. It was a truth. Those women had lived, fully, painfully, and bravely, inside a world that tried to erase them.